to the Remarkably Loved Business series. I'm your host, Lindsay Shelton. Today, we're going to go a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole on customer feedback. We're going to get a little bit more specific, and we're going to focus on storytelling. Because the more you understand your customer, the better you can serve your customer, and the better you serve your customer, the more successful you'll be, as Paul says. So Paul is our speaker of the day. Paul Smith is one of the world's leading experts on business storytelling. That's a thing, and he is an expert. He was one of Inc. magazine's top 100 leadership speakers in 2008. He's a storytelling coach. He is also the best-selling author of the books The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, Sell with a Story, Lead with a Story, Parenting with a Story, and 4 Days with Kenny Tedford. His work has been featured all over the place in the Wall Street Journal, Inc. magazine, Times, Forbes, and Fast Company, among others. He holds an MBA from the Wharton School, and he's a former consultant at Accenture and a former executive and 20-year veteran of the Procter & Gamble Company. So without further ado, let's hear from Paul Smith on how to get those customer stories coming.
I think the best way to shift the conversation with a customer to the customer is to literally invite them to tell you their stories. But you can't just say, tell me your stories. Believe me, I've tried that. It doesn't work. As a researcher on storytelling, I've interviewed hundreds of CEOs and executives for my books. And it turns out nobody really thinks of the interesting things that happen to them as stories, unless, of course, it's the things that they tell people over and over and over again. But what you're trying to get out of people to shift the conversation to them is not the same stories they tell everybody else. You're trying to elicit new stories. And by the way, I know this because in writing my first book, every time I interviewed an executive, and then I would write them back and say, okay, based on the interview, here are the stories that here's the one story that I'd really like to feature in the book. I frequently got this response. Oh, I didn't know that's what you were looking for, because that's not really a story. That's just something that happened to me one time. Exactly. That's what a story is. It's a narrative about something interesting that happened to you. But people don't have those things in their brain attached to the word stories. They have stories attached to things that they tell frequently, not interesting things that happen to them. So you have to be smarter to elicit good stories from people. So here are several ways to do it. First of all, shut up and listen. Like, literally, if you can avoid filling the vacuum of a conversation with your voice, you're more likely for that to be their voice. And the quieter you are and the less you speak, the more likely they're going to tell you stories. In fact, I recently had a salesperson on one of my podcasts, and he told me one of the best lessons he ever learned was in his first sales call. He had his manager sitting next to him to coach him along on a conference call. And his boss frequently leaned over and pressed the mute button on the phone and just said, shh, listen, and then unmuted again. And he did that several times during the conversation, not because the guy was talking. It was because he knew the guy wanted to talk, and he was trying to coach him to listen more. So that's one thing, shut up and listen. Secondly, ask questions that require a story for an answer. That means ask open-ended questions instead of closed-ended questions. And open-ended questions specifically means asking about specific events in time. So, for example, instead of saying, what's your biggest problem right now, that's going to get you a one-word answer. They might say, oh, warehousing. Warehousing's our biggest problem. Well, that doesn't really help you very much. But instead, what if you said, tell me about the moment you realized your biggest problem was your biggest problem? Now that's going to elicit a story. They're going to have to tell you, oh, yeah, that would have been last month when our biggest customer, placed this huge order, and we went out to the warehouse and we couldn't find enough of the product. So we had to schedule a special production run and make all of it last minute. It was really expensive. And of course we had to ship it expedited, and that was even more expensive, but we got it all there in time and it was great. And then we went out to the warehouse and found the product that they needed sitting right where it should have been all along. Now you know what they mean by a warehousing problem, all right? So ask questions that force them to tell you a story. All right, the third technique is use problem prompts. That means tell them about a problem and see if they've ever had it before, and they'll almost certainly jump into a story about themselves. So you might say, have you ever noticed that your internet gets slower after dinner? Well, now they're going to dive into a story about getting frustrated trying to watch a Netflix movie or something, right? So that will elicit a story. Now, the fourth and last technique really should be saved to last, and it's tell your stories first, right? So human beings are wired to listen to a story and then tell a similar story. So if I tell you a story about my kid playing baseball, guess what you're going to do? You're going to tell me a story about your kid playing baseball or some other sport. If I tell you about a story about me having a problem with my computer, guess what you're going to do? You're going to tell me a story about having problems with your computer, right? So if those first three methods fail, tell a brief story of the type that you want them to tell you, and it'll almost certainly elicit one. All right, the second question. As for what to do to reorient your organization to the customer long term, and the answer is establish official venues and incentives to create and collect those type of customer stories from your employees that I just talked about. Right, and there are a few techniques to do that. The simplest one I just call story circles. Invite your employees to sit around in a circle and do nothing but tell stories about your customers. All right, and order pizza or something, right? And so the rule is for the next hour, the only thing you're allowed to do is eat pizza and tell stories about customers, right? And that will get people in the frame of mind to constantly be thinking about and telling stories about your customers. A second method to do that is in each of your staff meetings, assign somebody the role of this staff meeting, you have to tell a story about a customer, right? So this week it's my week, next week it's your week, next week it's his week, next week it's her week. Everybody knows when their week is. And so after a year, you've got 52 great stories about your customers, but more importantly, you've got people constantly thinking about your customers because they know that in 3 weeks they've got to tell a story about one. All right, third technique. Hold a contest for the best stories. Literally, like put it on your company website, story contest, submit audio, video, whatever, and reward people for submitting the best stories. You'll have the whole company working on stories, thinking about your customer. So the goal is not necessarily to get the best stories, although that'll be nice. Now you've got those stories to tell. But what you've done is encouraged everybody to think about your customer constantly. All right, and then the last idea here is host a client conference where your customers meet each other and share their success stories with your product so they can all get more value out of you. All right? And it works for several of my most creative clients do this, and it works phenomenally well. So now you've got your clients telling stories to each other about your product, and you get to listen to all those stories, and you've created an entire venue that's just focused on your customers. All right. So in summary, the more stories you have about your customers, the better you understand them. The better you understand them, the better you'll serve them. The better you serve them, the more successful you'll be. Good luck.
Welcome back. That was Paul Smith from leadwithastory.com. He shared some awesome tips on, first off, just listening, on how to gather feedback in a better way, how to get your customers to perhaps open up a bit more. He mentioned muting yourself, asking open-ended questions, and opening with problem prompts, like, has this ever happened to you? He also talked about, sharing. So share your own story that you, like a story that's similar to the story you'd like to hear, and then you'll likely get that back. We experience that all the time when we're having a drink with our friends, or storytelling is a bit contagious, right? So with that said, the activity for today is going to be to follow up with another customer. I know that we did this with Chip, but this time we have a more specific approach to it. So you can use one of those techniques. You can follow up on anybody recently who made a purchase or had a service complete. You just want to touch base with them and say, hey, I just wanted to check in, make sure your product is working well, or, whatever. And then ask an open-ended question and give them the space to talk. I know sometimes we get nervous and we just kind of want to fill that space, like he was saying, just want to fill that space with noise. Don't fill the space with noise. Don't do it. Give them space to talk. And if they're hesitant to talk, then have an open-ended question ready And if they're still hesitant to talk, maybe have a problem prompt. And you could even, glean some feedback about a particular service or product right then and there. I've seen that some people are experiencing this issue. Have you had anything like that? Okay, we just want to make sure that everything's perfect and your customer, that you're totally satisfied with their service. And then he was talking about how to add that long term into your customer, or not your customer culture, but your team culture, which is really the most infectious way to do this. And the goal is to get your team to be constantly thinking about the customer, which will have the customer top of mind. It'll lead to insights about what products or services you need to start providing that you don't currently provide, or maybe some that you just need to stop providing that aren't really serving you or the customer. And you can do that in a couple of ways. He mentioned doing story circles, maybe monthly or quarterly, and that's kind of a larger event where it has a very intentional purpose, and maybe you have some food and you sit around and you tell stories about the customer. He also mentioned integrating it into your weekly staff meetings, which I really love. I think that's probably the lowest effort, regular thing you can add to your normal business week. So you could also do that today. Just have a simple initiative where you say, follow up on the next meeting that you're going to have with your staff and say, hey, Tina, I would like you to tell a story about the customer. This is something we're going to do at every staff meeting. We'll talk about it at the staff meeting, and then we'll make a schedule, and everybody will know when to show up and tell a story about the customer. I think that was really cool. And then you can make it fun with a customer contest or a story contest where you elicit stories from your team, and maybe the best story. You can have like a whole series of awards: funniest story, best story, story we wish we didn't hear, anything like that. And then he also mentioned a client conference, which is much harder to do at this time, but nonetheless, it is an option. A Zoom call could be a client conference. So stories tend to stick better than facts, and it helps to, when you're sharing these kinds of things with your team, it puts it top of mind. And I think that was my favorite thing about what he said, was that the ultimate goal is to get your team to always put the customer first in their mind. And these initiatives are you as a leader showing them the way. This is what we're going to integrate all the time in our normal business operations, because stories are contagious. Team members will share, and they're inspirational, which is very important to having a successful business. We want to work for companies that are making a difference in the world. And when we are hearing stories, we're making real impacts on our customers. That makes us want to show up to work, and that's a beautiful thing. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please let me know how the activity for the day works for you, and answer the survey. I love feedback. Okay, have an awesome day.